All right, so now that you've learned about your appliances, let's learn about the things that you use with your appliances in order to make some delicious food. But first, an analogy. Pot is to square as pan is to rectangle. Now what that means is a pot can be called a pan, but a pan can't be called a pot. Kind of confusing, I know, but let's just dive into the differences between the two. So a pot is usually deeper and it has steep sides. That's because, sorry about that, it is made to handle liquids very well, whether it be soups or pastas. That's what its bread and butter is. A pan, on the other hand, is usually shallower and their sides are smaller, as you can see with these two examples. And usually it only has one handle versus the two that a pot has. Then you have the red-headed stepchild, which is a saucepan. So a saucepan is kind of like a mix between the two because it's a little smaller, and it's only got one handle. So let's talk about different types of pan. So here we have a saute pan, and you can tell it's a saute pan because it's got these straight 90-degree edges. This is really good for pan sauces. So you cook your meat on there, and then you take the meat out and you deglaze the pan with some wine or some delicious liquid, and it mixes with those bits to make a delicious sauce. The steep edges are great for sloshing and much better than this here. This is a skillet, also known as a frying pan, and you can see the edges on this are a little angled. That's really good for getting down into the pan, using spatulas, things like that, to flip and move around your food. Easier to maneuver, not as good for liquids. All right, let's talk about types of pans. So first, what we've got here is non-stick pans. So non-stick pans are coated in Teflon or a similar chemical that allow it to not have things really stick to it. And that's good because, one, when you're cooking things, if things aren't moving around easily, they can tear, they can rip, and it makes it a mess and kind of ruins your meal sometimes. But more importantly for me is the cleanup. When you have non-stick pans, it makes cleanup so much easier than when you don't. Nothing beats not having to scrub those burnt on bits off of the pan. Then you have stainless. So stainless is more durable, it can take higher heat, and you can also cook on the stove and then transfer something to the oven. So it's nice because you can do that. Stainless steel is usually used in higher end chefs and restaurants and things like that. And that's for all the reasons I just mentioned, but also because it lasts really well. One thing I didn't mention about the non-stick pans is you don't want to use metal utensils with it, because as you can see here, there's little scratches on there, and that's where the coating is no longer there, and so you're going to get sticking there. And so because of that, you actually have to replace your non-stick pans every few years. In my opinion, non-stick pan is still the better way to go for home chefs, especially beginner home chefs, but you do need to keep in mind that you may need to replace it from time to time. Then we've got cast iron. This is one of the oldest ways to cook food. You can cook on a campfire, you can cook on your stove, you can put this in the oven, you can do any combination of those things. This bad boy here has actually been in my family for decades. Now, coming from the South, you've got to have a cast iron pan. If you don't have a cast iron pan, you may be disowned, because there's only one way to make cornbread and fried chicken, and that's in a cast iron pan. Some nice things about them is they've got a thicker wall, and so therefore they retain heat better, they distribute it more evenly, which is good for cooking all around. They do take a little bit more care than your non-stick pans, but it's worth it.
Oh, and you actually get some trace amounts of iron in your food when cooking with these. Good for the blood. One last note about cast iron, there is a certain way to season the pan that bonds oil with the metal, which actually makes the pan non-stick. Pretty cool, huh? Another type of cast iron is enameled cast iron. Basically, they take cast iron pans and coat it with a porcelain glaze. As you can see from the pictures, one benefit of this is that it looks pretty because it's a smoother surface and they can add color to it. That smoother finish also means that the pan doesn't rust and it's easier to clean. Plus, it's great for cooking tomato soup or anything with acid that would eat away at the cast iron pan. As you may guess, the biggest downside of enameled cast iron is cost. it is multiple times more expensive than cast iron. Single pans can cost hundreds of dollars. The other downsides are that it isn't as durable, it is not non-stick, and the pan may have some hot spots. Lastly, you don't get that iron in your food. Darn.
Then you've got copper. So copper, a lot of times, is just a stainless pan that's been coated in a thin layer of copper. Now that coating of copper is nice because it gives it somewhat of a non-stick surface. So you may see this on infomercials where you can cook an egg without any butter and things like that. They're nice, but a little more expensive than your average non-stick pan sometimes. So something else to consider. All right, let's talk about bakeware. So when it comes to bakeware, you've got two main materials. You've got glass, which sometimes you'll hear the word Pyrex. And Pyrex is just a brand of glass that was made specifically for high heats. In the oven, you can even use it in the microwave. So glass is great. It retains heat really well, similarly to a cast iron pan, and it gives it a nice even distribution of heat. This is good if you're going to be cooking casseroles or things like that, and it's really great for serving things on the table because it keeps that heat. The downside though is it's fragile. If you drop it, then it's going to break, or if you put it in an empty oven with an empty pan, it could get hot too fast in certain spots and crack. Or if you take a hot glass pan and you put it in cold water, that drastic temperature change could lead to cracks as well, which is not good. The other type of bakeware is metal. Here we've got a pie dish, and the nice thing about metal is it really helps you get things crispy. It's good for obviously pies, but you can use different types of pans to cook potatoes or brownies or cookies, anything that you want to get a nice crisp on. And another big pro is that it is a lot more durable than the glass. One last note though, when you're using the metal pans, if you're going to a high temperature, make sure to check the handles and the lid to make sure that they can handle those high temperatures as well. We have one metal pan I was using to make bread, and I had to take the handle off because it couldn't go up to 500 degrees. Which reminds me, one last thing. Don't broil in your glass. It's too hot, it can also cause it to break. I know it seems like a lot of rules, but most of the time you're going to be baking, it'll be at lower temperatures, 350, 425, and that stuff's fine for all of it. So that's it for your basic cookware. Let's move on to the next section.